Today we'll be working on our Derbi Piston Port. We're going to put in the one-way bearing and also be removing the starter clutches that are completely shot on this particular moped. So I'm going to use a 36mm socket to remove the main retaining nut on my variator there. Usually you're going to have a little locking washer on there as well. I just don't happen to have one because I'm a dum-dum. Go ahead and take that off, set that off to the side. Don't want to lose anything with that. We don't need to change anything on those. Slip the belt off here. I'm going to pull out the rubber grommet that holds all the grease in, if you still have it, that is. And we will be removing the nut that's holding the clutch bell onto our crankshaft. Standard lefty-loosey on these, since it is the piston port. Little washer gets away from me there. Don't lose that. Like I almost did. Go ahead and set those off to the side as well. So there's our shot shoes. And there goes my bushing. Hold on to that too. Alright, so first thing we're going to do is we'll pull that bushing out. You saw mine was already loose, but just kind of show you here. If you need to, take a small screwdriver, just push it out from the back end. Should just come right out. It's not too covered in grease. Save that for later, just in case you ever need to go back and somebody loses theirs. At least you'll have a spare. We're going to start by removing the starter clutches here. There's two little plastic O-rings there that you see me struggling with. Mine are were rubbing on the clutch, so they kind of melted almost around the thing there. So I kind of struggle with it a little bit. And they were all pretty dirty, so these kind of were a pain in the ass to get out, to be honest. There's the two plastic washers. Now usually what helps with this is just kind of wiggle them and pull up as much as you can. Sometimes it's a little tough to get your fingers in there. As you can see, I'm kind of struggling. If you want, you can sometimes remove the springs. Usually on these they're not very strong, but shouldn't have to. Just takes a little bit of love and obviously a lot of time in my case. And just throw those directly in the garbage. Or hang them up, I guess, if you really want to keep them. Nice and cleaned out. Much better. So we're going to take our snap ring pliers. There's a retaining clip here that is over our outside bearing. Just squeeze it in, set that side. Make sure you don't shoot it across the room. And then we're just going to take, I found a socket, I believe it was a 10 mil, and then a little extension. That fit perfectly on the inside race of our... Oh, there goes the sign, of course.
Going great.
Of our roller bearing that we're going to be replacing. You can see all my rear bearing, the spacer, and the roller bearing are now out. And here is our kit. It's got a little dowel to line up our spacer and our rear bearing when we reinstall them. And our replacement one-way bearing. And it also has a new collar there that will be replacing the stock one. Notice one side's got kind of a beveled edge and the other side is smooth. This will kind of help you with direction. In this particular case, the beveled edge we put towards the motor, so it spun the correct direction. The other way would be no good. Piston ports do spin from your point of view. It would be clockwise or with the wheel. Flat reeds and stuff like that, the reason they're a little different is taper of the crankshaft's different, and it actually spins the opposite direction, so we don't want to screw that up. Use a little bit of heat here just to help get the new one-way bearing in. just make sure you triple check and quadruple check the direction of the bearing before you install it. Now, unlike a Hobbit or anything else, there's no real retainer as far as how deep this roller bearing needs to go. So it's a bit of an eyeball trick. The big thing is you don't want to have too much pressure between the spacer, the rear bearing, and your new one-way bearing, but you don't want it too far out either. So it's a bit of a guessing game. You could mark it beforehand, but seeing down in there sometimes can be a pain in the butt. Just took a socket here. Slowly working around. I'm actually not hitting it terribly hard, but we got it down there. Of course, I got a friend to help me. And we're making sure that we're hitting on the outside of the bearing here, trying not to deform it in any way or get it in there crooked, taking our time.
Double check you put it in the right way, right?
Yeah. And I showed it to the kids. Try it that way. We tried it the other way. Now we're going to have the spacer here. And then I'm going to put the dowel in to line up the other bearing as well, so it goes in correct. One thing I did have to do, the dowel wasn't quite long enough. It wanted to sit too far down, so I just threw another socket underneath just to keep it up. So what we're going to do is we're going to take another socket, and we're going to make sure we get this other bearing started. Make sure you're hitting on the outside edge of the bearing. You don't want to ever be putting any pressure on the inside ring of the bearing, because you could mess it up. Do your best to just find a socket that is the same diameter of the one you're working with. In this case, I did not have the exact right size. Wasn't in my shop. I was over at my friend's, so I had to do the best I could. So this one was just barely too small, so I kind of, you'll notice I'm spinning it a lot, just kind of hitting that outside area and just little taps here and there and spinning it a little bit by little bit. Do your best to not hit the plastic retainer that keeps all the magical grease in. I did end up hitting mine a little bit, and it kind of dented it in. So don't be like me and screw it up. Just kind of give it some love taps down, and it'll seat down so we can get that retaining clip back in. Just give it a little push down until you hear it snap and lock into place. Do double check as well that you're not putting too much pressure on that front bearing and you did put it down far enough. You'll know immediately if your bearings can't spin. Going to put in the new spacer. I do have a stock crank on this piston port, and it seems like it would fit perfect on an aftermarket one. We tried out an aftermarket Hobbit crank, slipped right on perfectly, and I believe it was measured off of a aftermarket piston port crank. So this one was just a little tight. I ended up just taking a little bit of sandpaper and carefully just working my way around on the crankshaft where that sits. It was just so tight it didn't even want to go all the way on. You don't want it crazy loose, but just take a little bit of love. Make sure you're not also catching the threads with the sandpaper as well. Just working on the bit of the crankshaft just behind it, being very careful to not be actually sanding the threads. Just a little bit at a time. Don't go too crazy on it. Doesn't need a ton. And you may not even have to do this. And here we are trying it on a Hobbit one. Fit perfectly. So just a hair off, but that could be stock crank. Oh well. Finally, success. So we're going to put our clutch bell on, make sure it spins freely. And I'm going to work in our little spacer. Using a little tiny screwdriver and a spinning motion to just kind of seat it into place. Obviously, I'm spinning it backwards away from the one-way bearing. Getting it down in there. Then we could do our washer and our nut to tighten it down on the crankshaft. At this point, it seems pretty loose. It's not going to turn the motor over quite yet, but once it gets that pressure on it, it actually will. So just making sure I'm tightening it down a little bit by hand here so we don't screw up any threads. If I can get the nut on. No pressure. It's not on camera or anything. There we go. You'll notice it's already kind of giving pressure. So it spins perfectly backwards and then forwards in the direction of the motor. It puts pressure on it and forces the engine to turn over. It spins freely the opposite. No wiggle, no nothing. We're good to go. So we're going to slide the belt back on. Just triple checking everything. And we're going to put the variator back on. And you should be putting on a locking washer, but I don't have one. Slowly work on our main nut. I like to kind of work this onto. I don't like to just throw an impact on there and squish the belt. So you'll notice I'm kind of spinning the variator as I'm turning it, and then I will actually relieve some pressure on the back cheek so I can hand tighten it as much as possible before I give it any taps with the impact. Real light. And then I will replace my grease thing. Another note here, you'll see me start it up. Easy as that. These one-way bearings do not actually use the grease as you're used to putting in your variator. They actually are supposed to be oiled instead, so no grease. But success, we have a working, running piston port Derbi one-way bearing conversion.